Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for having me on, and thanks to the Tempe Center for the Arts for putting on this cool thing. I've been doing quite a few more of these Zoom visits and Zoom broadcasts in the last 4 months, as you could expect with everything that's going on. So it's a good chance for me to talk a little bit more about my work and all the things that I do. Today I'm going to just take a little bit of time to go back and show you some of my work throughout my career. It's been kind of a long one so far, 30 years or so. So I've been at it since before the computer days, primarily a digital artist now. But I'll take you through some of that transition and what that was like to go from conventional art to digital art. And then I'm going to break open a little bit about Photoshop for you guys, because that's my primary program that I use. There are many great drawing and painting programs out there, but I grew up with Photoshop and I kind of stuck to it because it's the one I know the best. It's a very, very powerful tool. We are not going to do a whole Photoshop tutorial today. There's not nearly enough time, but primarily what I want to do is just kind of introduce you guys to the basics of Photoshop, and more importantly, like, how do I use it in my work? Because there's a whole, I'll say right up front, there's a whole lot of stuff I don't know about Photoshop. And if I need to know it, I'll look it up and try to figure it out. But I'm pretty much in a comfort zone with that program. So we'll go into that in a little bit. So first, I would like to, let's see, not quite yet. Let's do a little screen share. And you should be seeing my website right now. And Michelle, tell me if you're not. So let's see. I started working in the late 80s and as a freelance illustrator. And so back in those days, I primarily was working as a scratchboard artist. And I'll show you some very early, my earliest work. So this is some of my earlier work. This is done on scratchboard. It looks a lot like it is woodcut. And the benefit of scratchboard is that woodcut takes a very, very long time to create. And if you're doing commercial work and you have deadlines and so forth, it is something that time is of the essence. And scratchboard in the end as a printed product looks exactly like a woodcut would. So I was very interested in sort of the WPA style of art, which really had sort of a resurgence back in the 80s and became quite popular for magazines and advertising and so forth. So this was done at about 6 inches by 9 inches on a blackboard. You take a razor blade and you scrape away the black, and it reveals the white clay underneath. Let's see. So most of my work early on was black and white because I couldn't figure out really how to color these engravings. In the early days, I would take Dr. Martin dyes. It's a kind of a very saturated dye line. I would daub it onto the white part of the clay, and the black part would be resistant to water generally. So that could colorize some of the white areas, but the colors never stayed the same. And over an hour, they could fade, they could change. It was very imprecise, and I didn't really like it. Eventually, in the mid 80s or so, Xerox machines got really, really good. And I found that you could run high quality watercolor paper through a high quality Xerox machine. And you got a product that was a print, and all the black was water insoluble. So the black would not be messed with water. Water wouldn't dissolve the black, in other words. And I could use and then the white parts of the paper would capture the watercolor. And it worked really, really well. I think I have an example of that here. And I'm not seeing it right now. I don't know why. My website's running a little slow. There we go. So this image here, you can see the coloring is sort of modeled, and that's because you're looking at a piece of paper that has a print on it. This was a pretty big piece for me. I kind of started to define my style, as it were. So I did many, many other pieces that are similar to it. Let's see. So that worked out pretty well for me for quite a while. I did a lot of artwork that way, and gradually, I got my first Macintosh, I think in 1995, and Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop came out in versions 1.0, hard to believe. When I started experimenting around with my computer to add color, because this was still my constant bane, how can I add color so that, when I was making the print on the watercolor paper and doing the watercolor, I still had to ship that art to a client somewhere. And deadlines being what they were in illustration, still are, your deadline is basically 4:30 on the night before you ship a piece of artwork, because that's when FedEx is going to pick up all their stuff from their boxes. So you still have the chance that it might get lost or whatever. So I was trying to find a way, could I create a totally digital art that I could then email or send via a disk or something. So I was experimenting with adding color via via Adobe Illustrator, and we're not going to talk much about that program today, but it allowed me to kind of just basically use an eyedropper tool and just drop color wherever I wanted to see it. And some of these are a little bit more recent. I'm trying to find the older ones to kind of progress our discussion. This one's a little bit, there's another good one. So one of my first, this was a black and white illustration. And I thought, well, it would be really great if this had some color to it. So this was one of the first ones I experimented with, turning the black into a color and turning the white into a different color. And in Illustrator, this is pretty simple. So what I had to do was I had to scan my image. I got a good scanner. I had to scan my image, then I turned my images. There used to be a program, and I can't even think of the name of it anymore because it's no longer around, but it would take a pixelized piece of artwork, and we'll talk more about that, and I turn it into a vectorized piece of artwork. And after it became vectorized, I could then add color in Illustrator. And this is some more of my favorite ones. I did a whole series of covers for Arizona Highways. Some of you may remember it, you guys out there listening. I did 12 of them in the year of 2017. That was a really fun job. Again, this was all completely digital artwork. But I had a varied career. Also, before I run out of too much time here, I have 15 years ago, I started to write and illustrate my own children's books. And I think I have 15 books in print right now. Maybe, I think my 16th one is coming out soon. And if any of you listeners have kids or are kids, you might recognize some of these titles. Dino Trucks was, this guy right here, was made into a TV show for Netflix. You can still see it. They did a pretty cool job of turning my characters into even cooler ones. Recently book, I started doing nonfiction. I vary my style. You might be interested, like you might see a variety of my style as you look through different pieces that I've done. And that's definitely true. I mean, I've gone through a lot of phases in my work, and I tend to want to try new things a lot. So you can see over 30 years that a lot has kind of shifted and changed. And especially when I got into children's books and I started creating them, I wanted to vary up my styles depending on the subject matter. You know, do I want it to trend toward a younger audience or toward of a third grade, fourth grade audience? That all depended on what age group I was at. Because some of my work is sort of cartoony, and though I don't really call myself a cartoonist because I never really was one. But this guy you're going to see later here today, because I've picked this artwork or a bigger version of it to kind of show you how I made it. I can't, it's kind of hard to say I drew it because you are creating so many shapes in 2 dimensions that it almost sometimes feels like you're actually building something in 3D. Let's see what else. Oh, and I did, for all you grown-ups out there, I did illustrate one grown-up book, and this is the PDT cocktail book, which was a bestseller for quite a few years. I collaborated with my friend Jim Meehan, who's a famous bartender in New York City, to do this great cocktail book, and it had 350 illustrations in it, I think, give or take. It took a long time to do, but it's a really fun book. So as I progressed in my style, with Illustrator, you're pretty much limited to flat color. You can use gradients, and I certainly have cheated the system to use gradients in places, but if you'll notice, like in this illustration, this started out as scratchboard, which I scanned, and then manipulated the color of which to create the final image. But you'll notice that everything here is flat. It's very much like a comic book. And I was trying to find ways of really having better control over my gradients. And so I turned eventually to Photoshop, which is what brings us all full circle here. And because once I got more comfortable with Photoshop, I realized how I was able to do almost everything I could do in Illustrator, but I had a much greater range of textures, like you'll see here in the face. I was able to do transparencies better, just something that felt a little bit more organic. And I'll try to give you another really good example of that. This was a fun one I did for Arizona highways. Not a whole lot of gradient here, but the hat you can see definitely. I find that next to impossible to do in Illustrator because it's just not set up that way. And I'll kind of explain why later. Okay, so we are going to enter the realm of Photoshop. So I'm going to stop my share for a second.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So for maybe some emerging artists or young artists, can you talk a little bit about kind of the foundations of drawing and how that has helped you in what you do now? Because you did mention like what you're doing in Photoshop is kind of like building in 3D, but do you think your foundation in a drawing background has helped you?
Oh, it definitely has, yeah. Because I can use the tool of Photoshop. I can visualize what my art's going to look like, and then I'm using a tool such as Photoshop to bring it to life. And I can visualize that because I've done so much drawing, you know, in my lifetime. So I can think if I'm drawing this train you're going to see later or whatever, that I know a certain amount of detail I want if it's going to have a lot of contrast. Is it going to be dark or light? And more importantly, like what is the composition going to be? And those are all the things you learn in just basic drawing, especially composition. And you'll see in most of my work, I pay, for those artists of you out there, I pay a lot of attention to composition, where no space is wasted, as they say. But I mean, I grew up without computers, so I had no choice but to learn the conventional way. I still would always recommend drawing. You're not going to have the eye-hand coordination. I draw with, I'll pick this up and show you because it's brand new, and this is what's called a Wacom drawing tablet. It is Wacom Intuos Professional model. It's really fat, it's thin, and it doesn't weigh too much. So this is what I draw on, and then this pen is the pen that makes the marks digitally. So basically the pen replaces my, my mouse, and it turns it into a super duper mouse. So I'm gonna start sharing here in a second, and we'll see. So I'm going to take you a little bit through, I'm going to spend 15 minutes or so taking you through the basics of Photoshop. So I can make it in a way that doesn't seem so intimidating. A lot of people think it's very intimidating, and I can see that you might think that. So I'm going to diminish this guy for a second just so we can focus on my tools. So in Photoshop, there are many, many, many windows that give you many great powers. You don't have to have them all out at once. You can't have them all out at once. And I, to be honest, don't even know what half of them are. Right now, we only have 3 out. So these three primary tool boxes, this is a layers box off to the left. And I'll explain that in a minute, what that's all about. These are your actual tools. These are the things that you're going to tell your little pen to be, basically. It could be a brush, it could be a square, it could be a selector tool. There's all kinds of things we'll go through in a second. And then we have a color window, and this is what's going to give my magical brush color. Let's see. Photoshop, the most important thing to remember about Photoshop is that it's all about layers. Layers and layers and layers. I'm going to open up a new document. And I'm going to make it just 8.5 by 11. When you create a new document, you have to tell it what kind of resolution you want it. Things that you create for the web are 72 dpi. Things that you get printed on paper, like books or magazines, are 300 dpi, or pixels per inch. So I always work at 300. I work in RGB, which to some of you may not mean anything at all, but there are a variety of color modes. RGB mode is associated with computers and monitors. CMYK mode is associated with things that get printed on paper. I work in RGB because pretty much all the printers are just working that way now, but either way. So I'm going to create, and now I have a new document. All right, so I have a layers panel that is empty because all I have right now is a background. So what kind of tools can I use to make something? And we'll see what we can do. I'm using my pen now. So let's just take something simple like a brush. So this is my brush set, my brush tool. I can also turn it into a pencil or some other things that I don't use, but I'm going to keep it as a brush right now. On my pen, I have a secret button that takes me to a shortcut that opens up a whole library of brush types. Now, these are the most popular, really. There's wet media, there are special effects. We don't have to go into all of that, but there's quite a bit that you can do. Now, a very simple brush would be this brush. It's just soft and round, and it has hard edges. And up here, I can tell it to have soft edges or hard, or I can make it bigger or smaller, depending on the size. So my little circle will get bigger as I change my size. So I can go up here. Now I'm going to say, what color do I want this brush's ink to be? So when we go up to our color wheel, right now it's on like a turquoise, but we can change all of that by changing our sliders or just by pre-selecting something from the rainbow down here. We can do that. So when I drag my pen across the paper, lo and behold, it becomes a brush. Now this particular brush is not pressure sensitive. And that means wherever I mark it, it's going to stay the same width, which has its pluses and minuses. And I'm going to take this background away real quick because I forgot to make a layer. Okay, great. So let's go back to our layers menu here. So Photoshop is all about layers, where you draw something on a layer, then you create a new layer and drawing something on top of that, and you draw another something on top of that. This will become much more clear when I show you how I drew the train. But the benefit of that is right now I could create an entirely new piece of artwork on one layer. On just one layer, and I could be just fine with that. But that is not my personality, because doing lots of layers on top of each other gives me great freedom to go back and change them. And if something is on top of something, I can say, well, I want it on the bottom of something. I'll give you a good example here. So I've done this kind of shape. Maybe let's just call it an apple. Now I'm on a separate layer. What can I do with that layer? Well, I can move this layer all around. I can do whatever I want with that. I can make it ghost away. I can change its transparency. What else can I do to it? Let's see. I can change its color. This is another great thing about working digitally. Let's just say I put out a big old glob of green paint on my canvas and I don't like it. my choice in the real world is pretty much going back and redoing it. But here it's like, well, I just put out green, but I really don't like this saturation of green. So we can go up to what I just went up to there. So I could do it kind of quick, was I went up to adjustments, image adjustments. So now I'm going to adjust the hue of my shape. Right now I'm running Adobe Photoshop 2020, and I upgraded from Adobe 5.6. And so some tasks have been rather slow, and this is one of them. I'm just going to wait till it finishes what it's doing. So back to this layer section here. You can create as many layers as you want. And I'm probably the worst at that, because the more layers you create, the more of a bookkeeping chore it really is. So what I like to do is I like to make sure that when I'm adding layers that I name them. And if I get working too fast, then sometimes I'll just get layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, and then I'm lost because it's hard for me to find what I have been drawing. All right, well, let's try it this way, because I think by me going through my actual drawing of the train, and let me give people a preview of it real quick. I'm gonna put that away. That's not the preview I wanted. Let's see. Okay. So this is the piece of art we're going to be talking about. It's from a book that I wrote called The Littlest Train. And this was a very complicated piece of art. And this probably took me about a week to create, in case you've been wondering how long does all this take. In case you're wondering, like, is digital art really faster than oil painting or any other kind? And you know, my answer to that is sometimes it is. Sometimes it's a lot slower. And I think it's just your personality, what you like. I like the flexibility of doing digital art because I was always, as a painter, I was afraid to make mistakes. I was afraid to have to redo something. And I was time conscious. So this all kind of really appealed to me. So that's a quick preview. So all illustrations begin with a sketch, or I should say usually, because I've done illustrations before where I didn't feel like I needed a sketch. So this was my sketch for that piece of artwork. It's rather loose. I tend to not do very detailed sketches because they take a lot of time, and then I like to get on with the business of doing my art. So this was the sketch that I presented, in my case, to an editor. And then they said, okay, that looks good. And there was some copy that went with this. There was some text that went on this page too. I had to make room for. So there's a long way to go between here and what you just saw. So first things first, I don't like drawing on white backgrounds, and I never have. So what I usually do is I usually put some kind of tone down in the background. And it doesn't, sometimes, most of the time, the tone you see here is not the tone you'll ever see in the final product, but it kind of gives it a warmth. Is it a warm scene? Is it a cool scene? I don't know. And if I don't like it, I can just go to my shape. Well, I better not try that again. But I can always manipulate the color by making it darker or just replacing it altogether. So then I'm going to go up to my sketch, and I'm going to ghost my sketch back, because I'm going to be kind of drawing on top of this. And I need it sort of as a guideline. And at this point in this illustration, I'm deciding, what do I want this locomotive to look like? Because it's my character, and it's been anthropomorphized. So what is it that he is going to look like? I didn't want him to be too chubby, and I didn't want him to be too much like Thomas the Tank Engine and all that. I wanted him to have kind of a real strong, beefy sense. So I did, which I normally do, some photographic research on some books, my nonfiction books, yes. On fiction, generally no. But in this case, I found a train somewhere, some picture of some locomotive, and I just needed some reference for where do all the pipes go? You know, how are the bolts arranged on the front of a steam locomotive? How many wheels are there? I just needed somewhere to start because I knew that if I made it up, the locomotive, if I made it up from scratch, it would probably end up looking like a child's toy. And I didn't really want it to be that simple. I needed it to have a certain sophistication. So I'm placing this here. I manipulated the angle of the perspective. I'm just placing this here now because I'm going to be drawing everything else right on top of it. And I'm just sort of using it as a bare guide. So in no particular order, I can't remember if you're following all my layers here, you'll see that there are an enormous number of layers, and folders have layers in them, and then folders have folders that have layers in them, and folders have folders that have folders that have layers in them. So this train, which I've labeled train, was just the locomotive that I'm doing here, is comprised of probably 400 to 500 different layers. Now, do I need to work that way? No. If I've completed something that I like, can I merge them all into one layer? I certainly could. And it's all up to your own preference. The downside to keeping all your layers as individual pieces, as I'll turn some of these on for you here. The downside is that you can lose them and you don't know where they went. And it can take you a long time to go and find them. I'm gonna start with my catcher here. So the catcher, the cow catcher, is comprised of at least 20 layers. And I'm going to turn them on a little bit at a time. So I'm using a pen tool here to create this shape. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a bit. And I'm bringing in some lines. And these lines are kind of signature for a lot of my work. It's a leftover from when I was doing Scratchboard. They are created all over in Adobe Illustrator and then brought over, and I manipulate them in their color here. So I'm creating, every one of these layers is a shape or an object that I have created. And some are big, some are small. Sometimes I'll get little objects like these bolts here, these bolt heads. Sometimes it's very tempting to say, well, I'm just going to clone these, and bam, 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 bam. I've got 6 of them, and I don't have to draw them each time. And that can be a very handy tool. I just caution people not to overuse it, because when you see it, you know it when you see it. And if you can hide your tracks for cloning, so much the better. But sometimes it's just a plain and simple time saver, just that simple. So I've created most of the catcher here. There's going to be stuff that go behind it. And let's see, what else would I have created by here? Eyeshadows. Let's see, you can see how arduous this is. I did a pretty good job on this drawing of labeling things, but there's tons of pieces that are just shape 74. I don't know what it is. I have to turn it back on to see what it is, you know. I'm guessing I did something up in the front for. So I've created like the nose of the steam of the boiler. I've created that with an ellipse tool. I can show you that real quick. I go over here to my tools, and I'm going to basically mimic eraser tool. Let's see, where's my eyedropper? I think it's somewhere here. Oh, it's right here. They moved this version of Photoshop. They moved all my tools around. I'm not used to it. So I'm going to take my eyedropper, which is going to sample this color right here. And what happened over in my menu? It turned my color wheel into that color. Very handy for like saying, oh, I love that color. The next thing I want to do should be that color. So I've used my eyedropper tool, and I'm just going to show you real quick about making an ellipse that will then be that exact same color. Now, when I've made this ellipse, I get a bunch of properties over here, and they give me a bunch of things that I can do to adjust or change or adapt or whatever to this shape. Also, we have what's called a special effects menu. When you double click on every layer, it brings up a whole bunch of other special effects that you can add just to this one layer. So it'll only affect this layer. So in this case, I have sort of, if you notice here, I have sort of an outline that's kind of a fuzzy, it's a sharp outline, but it fades into the purple. So that's what's called an inner glow. And zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to then tell this inner glow what exactly it is I want it to be. Right now it's white. I want it to be black. Right now it's in a screen mode, which is typically not used, so you use a normal mode. I want it bigger. So there you have it. So I can control all of this just on my layers menu. I also can add noise. And what is noise? It makes it look more crackly. So that's a demonstration of just making a shape. And that's where this guy came from over here. So I'm going to eliminate him. And we are going to go back and see what else is going to get turned on here. Let's see. So I want another layer on top of that because I want to see that it's got a kind of a bulge to it. And again, the great thing I go back to over and over again, here's a shape. What if I drew it and I didn't like where it was? If it was on paper, I'd have to draw it all over again. Let's say I wanted it here. Problem solved. Bolts. In this case, I think I did clone all of those bolts, and I hope I got away with it. If I find it to be too obvious, then I will select one or two of them and I'll rotate them or I'll stretch them a little bit, or sometimes I'll just draw them. If they're in different perspectives, I'll draw them all over again. The hinges are all in one folder, and I'm guessing there's just 2 layers for those hinges. So those I drew by hand. We can focus in a little bit more on them. These I drew by hand. And when you zoom in, if this is an inch right here, if you watch my arrow, on my screen it's really 3 inches. So you are very much zoomed in, and but no naked eye will ever see some of this little detail. And you just, through practice, you recognize how tight do you have to be, how perfect do you have to be, and you really, when you consider that the book is going to pre-produce at that size, you really have a lot of latitude. So there are some other bolts, and I got a whole bunch. I should have put all this stuff into a folder, but I didn't. And basically, I'm sort of using the photo underneath as a guide, but I'm making my own adjustments and improvements. Because for those of you who are beginning artists, I also caution you about how heavily you use photographs. It's tempting to try to find the perfect photograph to make the perfect art, but it never works that way. So for me, photography is, I use in my children's books only for historical accuracy, pretty much. And in my illustration work, I would use it as for portraits. So if I got to know what somebody looks like. I could have taken all these layers I'm turning on right now, and I could have combined them all into one very nice smaller file. This kind of file, for those of you guys who are familiar with digital work or for digital photography, this file I'm working on is about 150 megabytes. Not the end of the world, but I think Photoshop has a max of 2. That's a lot of megabytes. And the reason for it is because I've kept all my layers native. And if I had merged a lot of them, then the file becomes much, much smaller and more emailable. So you can see how I've referred to this sort of like I'm building a model in a way. Sometimes it feels like my art is like that. I'm building a model, but it's in 2D instead of 3D.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, that you like the art from the WPA movement, that's Depression era.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Are there other artists that you admire that maybe some of our patrons could look up and Google?
Well, I'm certainly a fan of the American precisionists at that time, Rockwell Kent, Charles Sheeler. They were popular right during that time period as well. And even though I didn't end up being a painter like them. And I certainly like the posters of that era because I worked in graphic design for quite a while too, and they influenced a lot of my work. Any Google search for like WPA poster or vintage travel poster, and I think you'll see a lot of a lot of influence to me. So farm stuff, I'm going to put that cow back because he looks like a last detail that I probably did. So I'm going to continue on with turning on my layers again. I've lost my track. So that guy I would have done last. Let's see what else is still out there. Smoke. The smoke was a detail I'll do last. The nose is there. The pistons. Those are comprised of quite a few layers themselves. Upper tank. That's quite a few layers by himself. The wheels, I've got them all in one great big folder, but I'm pretty sure there's quite a few. Yeah, it looks like the little wheels I drew by hand. So what I'm doing right now is it makes it almost seem like I'm creating these in front of you, but that's not the case. I'm really just illuminating their layers so that you can see what I've done. Because when you turn the little eyeball off, it hides the layer from you if you don't want to look at it.
Chris, I have a comment from
Mm-hmm.
Robin. She said, it's so amazing to see your process, blown away by the amount of layers.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful to see how you organize them. So it's been really great for them.
Yeah. Like I said, I know other artists who work in Photoshop as well. I probably would be the worst for keeping my layers the way they are. I'm just always afraid that I might want to go back and change it without me having then cut the artwork apart. It's like I said, in an illustration like this that's really heavy on detail, it really can get to be quite extreme, and that's why you got to be pretty organized about it. Let's see, what else we got here? I think we're done. Well, we're done with him anyway. I think I got a few more. All right, so our train is done. And I think when I did this originally, I probably did the train first because I really wanted to sink my teeth into what this was going to look like. It looks like we've got some smoke. Now I'll turn that on a little bit later. Let's talk about what's on the ground, what he's on. Again, in our list, in our layers list, everything that is on top of the one before it is on top of the one before it. It's exactly like a layer cake. So that's how you can move things from foreground to background. So let's see what, I'm guessing the front. Oh, yeah, I forgot to put on the little train. And he's comprised of many layers too. So, and I probably drew him by hand, but I might have made some ellipses and so forth in there. So the ground. So here's the track. Now this is a really interesting thing to draw, and I'll see if I can lift it up a little bit for you guys to see. So this is a curve that is receding into space, so it's got perspective. And so how am I going to do that? I ask myself this because this is kind of an engineering problem in a way, because I could draw it by hand, but it wouldn't look nearly as clean as the whole rest of the train. It wouldn't look as precise. So these guys were drawn probably as rectangles, as long, thin rectangles, you know, something that looked like, you know, like that. And then maybe I added the black, like, So then what I did was, so then I probably grouped this, and I went to my layers command, my transform command, which is up in here. Let me see, I'm going to let me just try to darken this real quick. Okay, well, we'll just leave it like that for now. So I'm going to merge these two layers. So now they become one layer, and you can do that anytime you want. There's a whole sequence of transform, we call it transform menu, which is here, and it allows you to do a whole bunch of things. Scale, rotate, skew, distort, and perspective, and warp. And I use these all the time because once I select something, it's going to select this layer. So now I've got my little control horns on it. So I'm going to go to transform, and in this case, I'm going to warp it. So now I've got a bunch of control segments in here. So I'm going to just start dragging. And you can see what's happening. And in this case, it still thinks it's two different layers, so we won't worry about that. But you can see I'm able to do basically anything I want with it. And that's what I did with these rails here. Because I knew I couldn't really hand draw those to my satisfaction. And so then I had to do the underlying wooden supports and so forth. Those were probably done one at a time. I didn't try to copy anything for that. And then I'm just using my artistic instincts to make it recede back into space. So that was the track. That's up here. I think you guys can see that here. I mean, this is artwork I created, and I'm still having to go back and say, where did I put that? Where did I tuck that thing in there? Now the back. So I have one big folder that is just called back. And you see how much when I illuminated my eye, how much came to life there. So I have an enormous amount of layers back there. And I'll just turn some of these off so you can see which this group is the very far back. But you can see, let me just move this around. So I'm gradually, I'm putting this whole image together. Pretty much all these sections of road and of field and all that are all on separate layers. I believe I did these lines here. You'll notice they're a little bit more hand-drawn. I probably did that with either an eraser tool or I used a brush and I used a feather sort of. Let's see if we can bring up something that looks like that and give you a demonstration. So back to our brushes, I demonstrated this to you. There are fuzzy brushes, there are air brushes, dry media brushes. I use those a lot when I want it to look like pencil. So I can say, let's go. Let me do a better job of that. So this is a more grainy brush. What I used before, and this has got a more organic feel to it. I use these a lot when I'm doing some of my children's books. And if I want to color something in and give it a little bit more texture, it just takes away, it makes it a little bit less digital. So what other kind of brushes here? Okay, so this is a pressure brush. And the reason why this is important is if you remember the first hard brush we used, the line was exactly the same width no matter how hard I pressed on my pen stylus. But in this demonstration here, if I just do it lightly, I go from thin to thick, And that's because my cool little brush is, my stylus, I guess you call it, is pressure sensitive. And you can adjust all of that in your menu all you want. But see, this can give me a much more organic feel for drawing. Creating like the locomotive is a very, it's a very shape-based kind of drawing, whereas the background here that I did is a much more organic. So a lot more was hand-drawn back in here, like the trees and the bushes. I think we can put the coal car back here. So there's the coal car. And then this got a little bit tricky here with the cars he was pulling, because I wasn't working from a model or anything, and these I had to imagine and do sketches for, so that the perspective didn't look really weird, because it's going down a hill, around a corner, and on top of everything else, it's receding back into space. So each one of those, there's car 1, car 2, was created individually. So let's see. Stones, tank, train. I think everything else is pretty much in the background there. Smoke is fun. This is another great example of the digital application of art. I'm able to make this smoke sort of wispy and transparent. And if I don't like it, I can just try again. Another thing to think about when you're working on a layer, if you're doing something that feels kind of experimental or dangerous, make a copy of your layer and then put the eyeball out, make it go invisible, and you can make all the mistakes you want and you still have your master layer. So that's the sky back there. I think there's car 3 and car 4. And the last car. And all their little wheels have to be eliminated. So what else can I tell you just about tools and options? Let me get this. And usually at this point, you can still see some remnants of my sketch. Usually at this point, it's time to just abandon the sketch and I'll get rid of it because it just gets in the way. So I think we got some extra lines in the sky. Yep. I think now everything is finally, no, there's some trees here.
Chris?
Yeah.
We had a comment from Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
She says, I know nothing about Photoshop. This is fascinating.
It's a really, really powerful, great tool for artists. Like I said, there are many other and less expensive programs for drawing and painting digitally. I just always tell people that, think like an artist, not like a computer programmer, and you'll get the result that you want. A lot of people who are new to digital art, maybe not with a background in traditional art, will do pieces that you can sort of say, yes, looks like digital art. And I don't want anybody to ever know how I made my artwork. I want them to guess and not know what the medium was, because if someone can look at my artwork and say, oh, that is digital art, whatever, then I probably haven't done a good enough job in terms of hiding my tracks. One thing I also do is kind of a signature thing, and I'll show you. Let's go back to here. I'll show you this. So if we zoom in on this, where did I do that? I don't want that. If we zoom in, you can see that there's a grain to everything. And I layer this grain. This comes in as one of the many filters that you can have to adjust your image. And it gives it a feel like that maybe this was all done on paper, like on a soft paper. and it sort of unifies the image, and it takes away some of its, what do you call, the overly crispness of it. So it gives it a more organic feel. I don't use it all the time, and I don't overuse it because it'll really, if you use it too much, I'm going to flatten this image right now. I'm going to blend, because this is a copy anyway, I'm going to just turn it all into one big layer. Boom. So now I've turned it all into a background. If I hadn't saved it before, I would never have done this, because you can't go back. Once you merge it all and save it, all those layers are gone forever. So if you're going to fool around with that, you can make a copy. But just real quickly talking about, here we go. Some of the other filters we can use, there's tons that you can blur, you can pixelate, you can sharpen. There's a type feature. We haven't even talked about that because we don't need to talk about that today, but there's a whole lot of fonts built into the program where you can lay out type and headlines and all that kind of stuff. Let's see, like I said before, you can adjust just about everything that has to do with color, you can adjust. And let's see if there's any other tools. I'll just talk about these tools really quick. This tool right here allows you to move the image left or right or up or down. Whoops, not that one. If it is on a layer, which we do not have anything on a layer here, that's eliminated right now. Okay, so there's a rectangle on a layer, and I'm going to use this tool just to move it around. Real simple tool, but it's used a lot. This is a selection tool. This draws a kind of a marquee, and there are other shapes too you can use. You can do elliptical or freeform. So this is kind of like a temporary mask. If I was painting something, let's rasterize this guy. So let's say I wanted to add paint to this gray square, but I only wanted to add it down here, or even I got an even better idea. Let's do it this way. This is where I want to add a different color of paint, and I don't want to get my digital paint all over the rest of it. So I would use a marquee like the square, or I could use the lasso, which is a freeform marquee, does the same thing. So when I go to pick up my paintbrush and I pick another color and I make it bigger.
Chris?
Yeah.
For beginners, what does the rasterize mean?
Yes. So there are two types of, I guess you'd call it imagery that we work with. The pixelized imagery and vector-based imagery. Vector-based imagery is like Adobe Illustrator uses that. And what it really means is that it's really just a computer code describing where the color is and what the shape is. If I real quickly, I know we did a little bit of time, if I make a shape like, I just made a vectorized shape. This shape cannot be adjusted via anything with pixels until it is rasterized and turned into pixels. So that's what that rasterizing means, turning a vectored shape into pure pixels. Right now, this shape, I can manipulate him all kinds of different ways, but I can't draw on him and I can't erase him. It's a very unique kind of thing, and it's kind of like the early days of, and it's beneficial for drawing shapes, I'll give it that. And I do use it quite a bit, but that is the main difference. But as you'll see, going back to our image here, because of that mask, I am able to keep it contained, keep the paint contained so that I can not just spray it all over the place or whatever. It's just a way of keeping things a little bit neater. In 2 more minutes, we've got an eyedropper tool. This is a tool that samples other colors, very handy, brings it up into there. A dodge and burn tool. This is from the photography era, or the photography lexicon, where you would make in the development process of making a print, you could make a print lighter or darker by using a wand. That's a long way of saying it. My pen tool. Does anybody have any other questions? Michelle, do you have any other questions? Because we just ran out of time.
So yeah, in closing, Chris, if you could just, do you have any new books on the way? How can we find
yeah, I
you on
do.
the internet?
I have, let me close out my screen share. Okay. I have two new books coming out, actually. This book will be coming out in August. This is another nonfiction picture book for the age 3 to 5, no, grades 3 to 5, right around in there. It's about the very first wide-body jet that was ever invented. It's the Boeing 747. Everybody knows it when you see it because it has that hump on top of the plane. But it's lots of facts, lots of story. It's a fascinating story. So that's coming out in August.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me. I hope it all made sense. You could talk about this forever. I know, you could take whole courses on Photoshop. So